Hello everybody! This video is to try to help you pick the correct laptop for your needs. I'm not going to mention specific hardware as that can change depending on when you watch this. This video is about general advice which is more or less accurate for decades now and might continue to be accurate for the foreseeable future. If you are expecting specific hardware recommendations, model, brand and so on, this video is not for you. Thank you for watching. Weight, size. If you plan on often carrying your laptop outside, then this can be very important. While a weight difference might not look like much on paper, in reality it can make or break a purchase which otherwise feels like a perfect one. If you plan on using the laptop only or mostly as a desktop replacement with rarely using it outside your home, then a smaller weight and size laptop is one of the least important considerations. It will not make you feel tired, it will not take space among the other things you carry. It will not affect where you go and where you can use it, because it will stay still as a desktop PC would. If you plan on using the laptop outside your home on a regular basis, then the opposite is true. It might at first sound like a very logical thing, but unfortunately many people do not take it too seriously. One of the most common mistakes is people going, for example, for the thinnest and lightest laptops, then find themselves with a laptop which cannot cope with their workload and lifestyle, because thinner and lighter laptops by necessity cannot have the performance of bigger ones under a sustained workload. On the other hand, one who needs a laptop to keep on their person at all times, yet they buy a laptop which is heavy and too big, by buying such large and heavy laptop end up ruining their day. There are also people who want to get the thinnest possible laptop, yet only plan on using it at home. I will leave aside the psychoanalysis of the matter and just say that if you absolutely need one type of laptop and yet you buy the opposite type of laptop, you'll get exactly what is coming to you: disappointment. Battery. Battery is the same exact situation as the weight size of the laptop. If you plan on having the laptop always plugged in, the battery is irrelevant. One thing I need to mention for anyone who might not be aware of this: Windows laptops are different to Apple laptops in how they perform plugged in or on battery. Apple laptops do not necessarily perform worse when on battery, where Windows laptops almost always perform worse on battery, with one possible exception: Windows laptops which belong on the light and not as powerful category. If you plan on getting a Windows laptop for great performance, chances are the battery it comes with will be either good enough, but the laptop won't be great performing when doing so, or the battery will be a joke when working at full performance mode. Bigger is better, but rarely you have an option for battery when picking a specific model. Keyboard. How a keyboard feels is obviously a very subjective matter. For example, I adore membrane keyboards. Others get anaphylactic shocks when not typing on mechanical keyboards. If you know how you feel about keyboards and planning on typing a lot on a laptop's keyboard, then make sure you get what is best for your taste. You cannot replace laptop keyboards with different type of keyboards, only with the same exact, and sometimes not even that. A second thing that you might want to take into consideration is the sound of the keyboard. If you plan on typing a lot in rooms where you are not supposed to be making a lot of noise and you have a loud keyboard, it might be an issue for you. For example, in a lecture or a library, you do not want to draw attention to your typing. In that case, you'll have to get a laptop with a quiet keyboard. I do have a last suggestion though. If you want to use your laptop for a long time, perhaps because you cannot afford to keep replacing your laptop, I highly recommend when you are at home or office to have an external keyboard plugged into it. This way, if something goes wrong with the keyboard, it's only the external keyboard that is affected, and also the laptop gets less damaged over the years from all the typing or possible accidents that tend to happen near keyboards. Trackpad. Basically what I said about the keyboard. There are different types of trackpads, some of which more noisy than others. Different sizes and materials, plastic, glass. What you like is of course up to you. Follow the general advice I gave for the keyboards and you should be okay. I cannot comment more on the matter as I really do not use them. I am a mouse and keyboard kind of guy. Noise. Noise of a laptop is strongly dependent on three factors. The two I already mentioned, keyboard and trackpad. The third is the fans noise, if the laptop has fans to begin with. Unfortunately, the fans are necessary for more powerful laptops, so if you need the higher performance, you cannot get away from them. But there are still a variety of options, with some laptops having more noisy fans than others. You will need to do your own research on what you find as acceptable and what not. A couple of things you need to remember though. Unless a fan is malfunctioning, it can be very quiet depending on how fast it works. The fan speed can most of the time be altered manually or through choosing a performance mode for the laptop, which in turn can affect the performance of it. The lower fan speed mode, the lower the performance of the laptop when working like that, either by design or necessity. It is also possible to have higher or lower setting for the fans based on the performance you are looking from the laptop and how much fan noise is an issue for you or your environment. If you find a laptop which you really like, but you check it and the fans are very loud, do not forget that you can most of the time alter that, with a penalty in performance which might not be that important for the amount of time or workload you have in mind. Sound. By sound I'm talking about the quality and loudness of the speakers and headphone output of the laptop. Now, as with any other computer or game console, if you want the best sound, you'll have to either connect an external speaker setup or a good pair of headphones. Having said that, if you know you are going to have to rely on the built-in speakers, this is a category you need to pay attention to. It sucks, no, it blows if you plan on using your laptop to watch videos or listen to some music without connecting anything extra to it and ending up having to stand still trying to listen properly the sound because the speakers are too weak or just bad. Most of them are above a minimum quality, but please check reviews of trustworthy sources. Unfortunately, buying an expensive laptop does not guarantee you'll get a good set of built-in speakers. Also, make sure if you rely on the headphone jack that your headphones are not too difficult to run properly on the laptop. Some of them are simply not good enough for that. But if you have a pair of headphones which are very difficult and probably expensive, you already know that, or you already have an external amp. Ports. For the love of everything that you love, do not ever buy a laptop with just one or two USB ports, especially if one of them is used for charging and the laptop does not have a dedicated charging port. USB ports can and do break down, especially those which you plug and unplug all the time. For a new system, as of 2025, I will never suggest anything which has fewer than 3 USB ports, with at least one of them being a Type-C port. Also, some of them have to be at least 10 Gbps speed connections, so 3.2 Gen 2 or higher. It would be better if the Type-C is at least USB 4 or TB4. Anything slower could be problematic in case you want to do lots of transferring of large files over USB, or for the case of the Type-C, connecting certain demanding hardware like an external GPU. I know there are new models of laptops, even so-called gaming laptops, which come with just 5 Gbps connections for USB, which should be legal. Do not buy them. Check it out. About the rest of the ports, I recommend an Ethernet port. Yes, even in 2025. Wi-Fi is not always available or safe. Also much more prone to disconnections. Obviously, if you use your laptop only on the go, it's not something which you will care for. Full-size SD slots are good, but for most people it's not a deal breaker, as you can easily have a USB device which can help, if you have enough USB ports available. Mind you, not all SD card devices are created equally, and their speeds can vary a lot. So if you plan on transferring large files often, that's one more thing to check on the laptop of your choice before you buy it. Connections for external displays are usually down to 2 types for a long time now. In the previous generations, we had mostly HDMI and DP, mini or regular. Before that, we had HDMI and VGA. Today, we usually have up to HDMI and Type-C with display function. You need to make sure you have the ports you need, and I do highly recommend you have at least one such connection available to you, if for one reason. If something goes wrong with your laptop and you do not know if the problem lies with a built-in monitor or not, we can find out by connecting your laptop to an external VDU and find out. Otherwise, you might need to pay a lot of money just to have a repair shop tell you you are in trouble. One connection that, while I consider important, is not one I use, the 3.5mm headphone jack. I use headphones, wired ones, all the time. But because I have my laptop connected to an external VDU and my headphones are connected to it, I do not actively use the port on the laptop. If you also prefer wired headphones and plan on using the laptop's monitor, then you better not forget about having this port. I know there are USB headphones other than wireless ones, but I cannot comment on that other than what I said before about the number of USB ports. One last thing, if you do plan on having your laptop at one location, you will be advised to have a USB hub, so that at the very least you wear out the laptop ports as little as possible. We cannot always easily, if at all, replace them if they get damaged. Screen. Screen, as with some of the other categories mentioned before, can be the easiest thing to not pay attention to, or even get a cheaper option if some are available. If you plan on having the laptop as a desktop replacement and always connect to an external VDU, it doesn't matter. But let's say that's not the case with you. Then what? The screen monitor of a laptop can affect the experience with the laptop far more than it might first appear. Color accuracy is something which, if you plan on creating content on your laptop, is going to matter a lot. At the very least, you need to get a laptop with a monitor which has at least close to 100% sRGB accuracy. Over 90% is usually fine, and apparently there is over 100% too, but I just can't help you with that. White balance is good to be under 3, which also helps with getting more accurate colors displayed on your screen. Brightness can be very important, especially if you plan on using your laptop outside or in rooms with bright daylight. In that case, I will not recommend anything under 400 nits, though the higher the better. If you plan on using the laptop monitor inside or without much daylight, then under that is fine, but do not go for anything under 300 nits. if you plan on using it as your main monitor. Gamma closest to 2.2 is what you want to get, give or take 0.1. More than that, you might have issues with color accuracy. There are more things you need to be careful of if you do color critical work, but if you know you need that, you probably know more about them than the scope of this video. Type of panel is the next part that is important if you plan on using your laptop's monitor as your main monitor. For the love of BIOS, do not get a TN panel unless you plan on playing games on it and you do not care that much about colors and viewing angles. In 2025, if I were to buy a laptop and use it with its monitor, I would not buy one with a TN panel. External monitors with TN panels can still be fine, a difference being you are not going to be moving the external monitor or looking at it in weird angles, which you might do with a laptop's monitor. OLED panels are great, perhaps the best, but they tend to be more prone to issues like burning and a couple more things I do not have first-hand experience with. If you plan on playing full-screen games on them, I do not think the risk of burning is serious, as there will be constant change of graphics all the time. Unless you play one game and that game has static elements on the screen. Even in that case, there are technologies in some monitors which help reduce that risk. But you are going to have to check with the laptop manufacturer to see if they have them implemented or not. IPS panels are my favorite as the middle ground, with their main issue being the black colors not always looking 100% black, depending on the screen. Not something you will necessarily notice unless you also have experience with OLED panels, which are far better on that. There are also VA panels, but I admit I haven't seen a laptop with such a panel, so I don't even know if there are such laptops out there now, at least new ones. Mini LEDs I have zero experience with. Resolution. Well, this is one of the categories I tend to be on a different level than most people, something which could be said about other categories too. While the higher the resolution, the better the screen might look, you must remember that the higher the resolution, the more work the GPU has to do to run it. Where for desktop work, business applications, modern GPUs will have no problem. If you want to play games, you will have problems. I plan on making a separate video on this, but in general, the higher the resolution, the more difficult it is for the computer to run at high enough frame rate the game you are playing. You'll sooner or later end up having to either reduce in-game resolution, or use lower settings, or aggressive upscaling to get a playable frame rate than you would if you run at a lower native resolution. It is true that due to the smaller physical size of the monitor, any upscaling or lower graphical settings will not look as bad as if the game was in a large external VDU. But the difference is still there. If you plan on using the laptop for gaming, I cannot recommend anything higher than 1080p or at least 1200p. Most tech YouTubers will get sick by hearing me say that. I don't care. Playing at natively lower resolution will prolong the life of your laptop in terms of game experience, and it will also consume a bit less power if that is something that matters to you, and it will look good on a laptop monitor. There's also the matter of refresh rate. Higher refresh rate is good to have, but do not be fooled. If you get a high refresh rate laptop with the goal of playing games at that higher refresh rate, chances are you'll have to stick to less demanding older games and some of the online-only games. New gorgeous games will always be too demanding to run them at high refresh rate, even more so if you also get a higher resolution screen. Your laptop might be able to handle them now, but sooner than later there will be games which it will not be able to handle. It's a bottomless pit. Mind you, many people disagree with this view of mine. What else is new? Performance. The one thing that most will consider the most important part. As before, I'm not going to mention models. CPU. For a low-spec laptop for very simple workloads like email, YouTube action, web browsing, get any CPU released in the last 4 years, regardless of when this video is viewed, with at least 4 cores and 8 threads. Anything lower than that could push the laptop more than it is necessary. There are lower CPUs like, as in 2025, the Intel N series, which are indeed only 4 cores and 4 threads, and should be able to handle very light workloads just fine, but I just couldn't in good faith recommend them for a laptop today. For mid and higher spec laptops, get at least 6-core CPU if you are on a tighter budget, but better go for a higher one with at least 8 cores if you can easily afford that and you know you are going to push the laptop with some heavier workloads. As before, if you plan on keeping it for years, do not go for an older than about 4 years old CPU. ARM or not? I do not recommend ARM, as x86 is too prevalent in the computer world. If the software you want to use is native ARM, then sure, go for it. Should the CPU be with or without an iGPU? CPUs without an iGPU tend to be faster than the same class CPU with an iGPU, which means they tend to be a bit faster for CPU exclusive loads and also tend to be able to more efficiently use the dedicated GPU. On a laptop where the dedicated GPU will probably not be upgradable, there is a limit on how much the slightly faster CPU will help you when used to run the dedicated GPU. I'm mentioning this because the iGPU, which will take some performance out of the CPU, might not take out performance you will in real terms need. But why would you want it either way with the iGPU if you plan on getting a laptop with a dedicated GPU? Well, for 3 reasons. The first is battery life and power consumption in general. Using for lighter work, the iGPU means far less power consumption and thus higher battery life than if you use a CPU without an iGPU and use the dedicated GPU of the laptop at all times. Even the least powerful dedicated GPUs consume far more power than the iGPU of a CPU. The second reason is overall performance. There are applications which can use the iGPU to take some of the load off the dedicated GPU, or even the CPU, which can make the overall experience of using the laptop with said applications far better. Video editing software is one, screen capturing or streaming applications is another. Even in cases where you have a dedicated GPU, which is a beast, the iGPU can still help on heavier workloads. The third reason is in case there is a problem with the dedicated GPU. Your laptop won't immediately turn into paperweight. GPU. The dedicated GPU, or even for higher-end solutions the iGPU of the APU/CPU of the laptop, is a very important part of the laptop. There are 4 elements of it you need to pay attention to when choosing which one to get. VRAM. The video memory of the GPU allows you to load textures in games and to help with special jobs like in heavy workloads in video editing. For light usage or simple video editing jobs, 4 GB of VRAM should be enough. but I would still not recommend going for that few. 8GB of VRAM would be more absolutely minimum I would recommend. Though if you plan on playing new video game releases, I will not get anything with less than 12GB at a minimum. Else you'll sooner or later find more and more games which will either have to run at lower settings or not at all. In case of an iGPU, as long as the laptop's BIOS allows it, you should be able to alter the amount of RAM allocated to work as VRAM. Still, you better make sure the BIOS allows that, as not all do. Pure performance. Get the GPU that is better suited for the resolution you plan on playing your games. The lower the resolution, the lower performance GPU you need. But, on the other hand, if you plan on playing at lower resolution, if you get a higher spec GPU, you will be able to run newer games for more years at the same lower resolution. How fast exactly you need it? Depends on the games you play. Unfortunately, you are going to have to check the games you want to play and then shop accordingly above the minimum spec needed to run the games. Otherwise, you'll need to go for the highest model you can afford, which isn't always the best idea unless you can afford everything. Raytracing capabilities. In 2025, there are already some games which require hardware raytracing for the game to even run. I do not think there are any new models that do not have this support, though you can still find laptops with older solutions which do not. Be careful. Codec support. If you plan on streaming or video editing, make sure the GPU, or at least the iGPU if you have one, have encoding and decoding support for the codecs you are interested in. Otherwise, you risk having extremely poor performance when dealing with them. Driver support. The quality of drivers from one of the three main manufacturers, Intel, Nvidia, AMD, depends on the time period. There are some things though that I have noticed over the decades which you might want to take into consideration. There are exceptions, but in general, Intel is the worst in terms of quality of graphics drivers and long-term support. AMD is in the middle, but they are getting better. If you plan on keeping the laptop for over 6 years, this could be problematic for Intel and perhaps for AMD graphics solutions. Things are improving with both of them, but based on the past, you might want to be ready for the worst case scenario. Nvidia, on the other hand, is the best at this, but there have been times where they drop the ball in terms of bugs and other issues. At the first part of 2025, they are going through one of those curves, but hopefully they will quickly improve. Nvidia is also easily the best in providing long-term support for their GPUs. Currently, they are still providing drivers for 11-year-old laptop GPUs. I know, I have one. That is several years longer than the other two. That doesn't mean they'll continue to do so in the future with future old GPUs, but I will not bet against them. RAM. There are two general types of RAM, soldered and unsoldered. If you have soldered, it means you cannot change, upgrade, replace the RAM. You might usually have faster RAM, which could lead to higher performing laptop, but the downside is you'll never be able to add more RAM if you need it. You'll never be able to replace the RAM if something goes wrong with it. On the plus side, other than the potential better performance, the laptop manufacturer will be able to sell you another laptop just because you have an issue with your RAM, or ask you to pay more, way more money than they could for a model with more RAM. Non-solder RAM can be a bit slower, quite a bit slower, but the expected difference in real-life performance is not necessarily even noticeable. You can upgrade the RAM if you decide you want more for a fraction of the cost. if of course the CPU motherboard supports more RAM. If RAM chips go bad or get damaged, you can replace it. Even yourself, if you are used to working with computer hardware. It's usually not that difficult. In 2025, I will not go for less than 16 GB of RAM, even for a basic laptop. For higher tiers, I would easily go for 32 GB of RAM, though if you know you are going to have a need for RAM for your workload, 48 GB or higher is not a bad idea. One thing that you need to remember is the case of having a laptop without a dedicated GPU, and thus having to use the iGPU for everything. iGPUs use the laptop's RAM as VRAM. The faster the RAM is, the better the iGPU will perform, which is one advantage the solder RAM usually has. No matter what type of RAM you have, any RAM used by the iGPU, manually or automatically, means less RAM available for everything else. If you use the laptop with the iGPU for applications which require a lot of VRAM, like demanding games or demanding video editing for example, then you are going to need more RAM to begin with. In cases of having to rely on the iGPU and use the laptop for more than basic tasks, I do not recommend going lower than 24 GB of RAM. If you have a very high performing iGPU, then 32 GB or higher RAM is advised. Obviously, if you would need X amount of RAM, if you had a laptop with a dedicated GPU, in the case of an iGPU only laptop, you are going to need that lost VRAM of the dedicated GPU. So get a laptop with enough RAM to cover the dedicated GPU's VRAM and the RAM the rest of the system needs. So if the dedicated GPU had 12 GB of VRAM, which you needed, and that laptop had 16 GB of RAM, an iGPU only laptop for the same tasks will be better off with 12 GB plus 16 GB of RAM, which is 28 GB of RAM. But since the configuration is not possible, then you will need to go for at least 32 GB of RAM, and so on. Non-volatile storage, aka SSDs. The classical HDDs, hard disk drives, are still available for purchase, but you cannot really find them in modern laptops, and so I will not talk about them. As with RAM, there is soldered and thus non-upgradable and non-replaceable storage, and unsoldered. The positives and negatives for soldered SSDs are more or less the same as with RAM. There are some extra things you need to consider going for SSDs. Capacity changes not only the capacity of the SSD, but also the speed and the longevity of the SSD. SSDs have a finite lifespan in terms of how many times data can be written on them. For a casual user or even a more enthusiastic user, the lifespan of most SSDs is more than enough for 5 to 10 or more years of usage. If, on the other hand, you are more aggressive with the usage of the SSDs, for example doing a lot of video editing with large files, then the lifespan of the drive will be reduced accordingly. But even then, the chances of it dying in the first 5+ years because of this are quite small, other than extreme professional cases. One thing that can directly affect that is the amount of RAM the laptop has. If the RAM is not enough for the needs of your workload, the computer will start using part of the SSD so that the system continues to work as you want it. Unfortunately, the extra workload will reduce the lifespan of the SSD depending on the extra usage. That is another reason to make sure you have enough RAM for your laptop. The smaller capacity SSDs tend to have shorter amount of data limits before they end working properly. So under 512GB of storage tend to have shorter lifespans than higher capacity. The same is true for their speeds. In general, in 2025, I do not recommend any new laptop to be with less than 512GB of storage for light work, unless it is very light work. For most people, 512GB and 1TB of SSD should be enough. I do recommend at least 2TB if you have any heavy work with your laptop, even if you do not technically need all that space at once. Also, the life of an SSD depends on how much free space you have on it. If you know you are going to need 900GB of storage, do not go for a 1TB of SSD. Make sure to have about at least 20% available free space on it and shop accordingly. One last thing about the SSDs, in the case of user replaceable SSDs, and NVMEs at that, there are different lengths of SSDs. The most common and better value for money is the 2280. However, you will also encounter shorter ones like the 2230. The problem with the 2230 is they tend to be more expensive per gigabyte. They are more difficult and more expensive to find a replacement, and they are smaller capacities than the 2280. Most laptops which have NVMEs have the 2280 variety, but there are some which not only come with the 2230 but also do not have enough physical space inside them to install a 2280. Make sure you know what the laptop can take. If, however, you do not care about the capacity of the SSD and you know you are not going to ever need to upgrade it, it doesn't matter. AI. Most new laptops have some NPU in them, which helps with AI tasks. I cannot help you on this matter, as not only I do not have one, but also I'm not crazy about the idea. If you know you are going to need an NPU, then good luck with that. Cooling, heat, is the one thing that can completely destroy your experience with a laptop, even if everything else is perfect. Not good enough cooling can be responsible not just for higher fan noise, but for reduced performance of the otherwise high-spec hardware and for damage or ruining of the laptop's hardware. If the GPU is overheating due to poor cooling, it will slow down and perhaps even get damaged. This can mean lower performance, or of course the GPU stop working completely due to heat damage. If the CPU is overheating due to poor cooling, the same, only that because the CPU makes everything else work, you can have a properly cooled GPU which underperforms because the CPU is underperforming to save itself from distraction due to overheating. To have a good cooling, you need three things: clean internals of the laptop, properly working fans, and good cooling solution design and implementation. You can keep your laptop clean by opening it and cleaning it. Check online how to do so depending on the model of the laptop. Replacing the thermal paste is also important. How often? It depends on the laptop and of the usage. Not more than once per half a year, but at least once per handful of years. It does depend on what temps you get, so obviously if the temps are low, no need to do that. Mind you, not all laptops use thermal paste. There are a couple other solutions nowadays, one of which is the liquid metal. While liquid metal can potentially give better results, it is also very dangerous material for your laptop if it gets where it is not supposed to go. It is also not as easy to clean up and apply as regular thermal paste. This is the main reason I do not use it and never plan on using it in the future. That includes buying a laptop with it already applied. Of course, to each their own. Fans that stop working properly can usually be discovered by reduced airflow and/or abnormal noise coming from them. In the case of a malfunctioning fan, you need to repair the fan if it is possible, or if it isn't, replace it. Now, it doesn't mean that the fans will definitely break down, but it is not a rare phenomenon. If you plan on keeping the laptop for many years, try to buy spare fans for the model you have, while they are available and easily found, especially if you do not have a very common laptop. Else, you risk having to stop using a laptop due to a faulty few dollars fan. The cooling design and implementation of the laptop is something which is very important and which most people do not pay enough attention to it, even large tech YouTubers. The problem with it is that it cannot be fixed. If the design is bad from the start, you cannot replace it with a better one. You cannot add new or better pipes or fins. You are stuck. When you check reviews or videos of the laptop you are interested in, check the maximum temps for the CPU and GPU. Check the model of the CPU and GPU and their thermal limits on the official sites, Intel, AMD, Nvidia. If the temps on the laptop exceed the limits on a newly opened and used laptop, avoid said laptop. Do not buy it. If the temps approach the limits by 10 or fewer degrees, be careful. Were the tests done in a cold room during winter, with perhaps an extra laptop cooling fan at work? Then avoid the laptop. If, for example, the CPU has a limit of 100 degrees, and in the review the CPU reaches 91 degrees, in a new laptop used days from unboxing and not years, absolutely do not believe the reviewer who says it's a fine temperature. The laptop will reach the limit and thermal throttle either in a few months or when the weather or the location gets a bit warmer. Be careful. Having said that, yes, it is possible the thermal paste application was terrible at the factory and a new better one by you will fix things. But that's taking a huge leap of faith. This means that a huge amount of laptop models are models that I would 100% recommend not buying, even models which other reviewers praise. Take that as you wish. You could say, they have thousands or millions of subscribers and I have 14 with decade-old laptops with zero money to get anything new. You will be correct, but I stand by what I said. Build quality. This is one of the hardest parts to talk about because unless someone has done a disassembly or used one for a long time, we cannot possibly know that much about it when buying a laptop. Things that I do not care about, but apparently they are all the rage among successful people online. Keyboard flexing, when you press the keyboard with your fist. Monitor not being 100% not shaking when you slap it. Both which for me are ridiculous. Unless there is a clear defect, it does not matter, nor does it show how much life the laptop has in it. No one is going to press on the keyboard in real usage, and the only time the monitor will shake in real life usage is when you open the laptop, and that will stop in a second or two at the most. The monitor's hinges, on the other hand, is a far more important part, at least if you are going to use the laptop on the go and open and close it all the time. Unfortunately, as I said before, nothing you can do about it, most of the time. In general, the overall construction material of the case, the laptop case, might direct towards one direction, where metal cases will tend to have a more steady construction, but that does not mean the hinges cannot still break. They might still do, just not take with them the rest of the laptop. There are two things that you could do after you buy a laptop to improve the longevity of the hinges. One is when you open and close the laptop, do it by holding the middle of the monitor and not the sides. The other is using your other hand to keep the base of the laptop steady even if the laptop can open with just one hand. Upgradeability. I mentioned part of this in the previous segments. In general, for the longevity of the laptop, it's better if it comes with user replaceable RAM and SSD. For these two parts, check the relevant parts of the video. If you plan on using the laptop a lot on the go, make sure the battery is not glued in the laptop, as some models have that way. It's going to make it more difficult and more dangerous when and if you need to replace the battery, especially if there is something wrong with the battery other than old age. If you plan on using the laptop's keyboard, try to get a laptop with easy to replace keyboard. Unfortunately, this is much harder to find in 2025 than in the previous decades, to the point I almost feel bad mentioning it. I do not know how much of a help this video was for you, but I hope it was enough. Enough to hit a like, subscribe if you haven't, and if you feel particularly satisfied, consider donating something with the Ko-fi link down below. Who knows, I might eventually get new systems and make more videos too. Thank you very much for watching. I wish you happy gaming and stay safe.